Hey, I'm Ashley Jackson, and this is Push the Next Generation, your Gen Z coded guide to power and politics. Today, we're breaking down how to stay in the fight and lose forward after a setback. Happy New Year! I think we've lived about 5 years of news during our short holiday break. We barely dodged a government shutdown, Luigi Mangione pleaded not guilty to murdering the CEO of United Healthcare, and we're inching closer to a transfer of power from the Biden-Harris administration to Trump-Musk. I mean Trump-Vance, I kid. But before we dive into the chaos ahead, let's take a moment to reflect. 4 years ago today, on January 6, 2021, our nation witnessed one of the most shocking events in modern history. A mob of Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to overturn the certification of Joe Biden's electoral victory, a process that was meant to formally confirm the results of the 2020 election. The attack, spurred by baseless claims of election fraud, was part of a larger plan by Trump to hold on to power. 5 people died within 36 hours, and countless others, including 174 police officers, were injured. Damages totaled over $2.7 million. Trump's Save America rally that morning fueled the violence, with thousands gathering to hear him say, "If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." By afternoon, hundreds breached Capitol security, vandalized offices, and sent Congress into lockdown. Pipe bombs were found near the Capitol. Trump's delayed response to call on the National Guard led to his second impeachment, the first president in U.S. history to be impeached twice. At Push the Next Generation, we honor those who lost their lives and the countless individuals who endured trauma that day at the hands of not only the rioters, but of our soon-to-be commander-in-chief. And yes, today Congress will once again convene to certify the results of the 2024 election. Let's just say we'll all be watching. Meanwhile, the 2025 news has not slowed down. From Mike Johnson's re-election as Speaker of the House to Trump's looming sentencing, from a devastating New Year's Day terror attack in New Orleans to a Cybertruck going up in flames, 2025 is already making a grand entrance. And lastly, we cannot forget to acknowledge the legacy of President Jimmy Carter, a true champion for human rights whose impact continues to be felt across the world. Now back to regularly scheduled programming. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Push the Next Generation, recommend it to a friend, follow on socials at Push the Next Generation Pod, and subscribe and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Okay, now that the begging is over, let's get into it. This week, I'll be speaking with Shannon Watts. Shannon is the founder of Moms Demand Action, the largest grassroots group fighting gun violence in the U.S. Known as the summoner of women's audacity, she has been named one of Time's 100 most influential people, a Forbes 50 over 50 changemaker, and a Glamour Woman of the Year. Helping to redefine what's possible when audacious women unite to drive change, she writes regularly for Substack and outlets like The Washington Post, Elle, Time, The 19th, with her next book, Fired Up: How to Turn Your Spark into a Flame and Come Alive at Any Age, coming out in June 2025, available for pre-order right now. She recently organized the largest Zoom gathering in history, mobilizing over 200,000 voters and raising over $11 million in support of the 2024 Kamala Harris campaign. She also co-hosted the Women Wednesdays for Harris Call with Indivisible, empowering thousands of women weekly with practical guidance on how to take action in the 2024 election, which I also had the pleasure to guest on. Shannon is truly a fire starter and a true icon living who we should all stan, and I'm so honored that she's joining us this week on Push the Next Generation. Welcome, Shannon. Hi, Shannon. Thank you so much for coming on Push the Next Generation. It's so good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Listen, I am just I'm in awe of you, honestly. Like, you're definitely one of my sheroes. I think, I don't know, I'm not, don't cry, Ashley, don't cry, get it together. 'Cause, I feel like the last few months have just been a lot, and you've been
I
such
know.
a beacon of light for me.
Well,
Yeah, it's been an emotional season. So, we're showing up, we're putting on makeup, and we keep going.
exactly.
Well, I think we should start at the beginning, just in terms of context for the listeners. This is a primarily Gen Z audience, and I want to make sure that they're in tune with yeah, they may know you on social media now, but where you started. So I actually really briefly want to start and ask you if you can share the story of how and why you founded Moms Demand Action, because I think that that's a great place for us to start.
Yeah, so back in 2012, I was 40 years old. I was the mom of 5, I still am, and they were much younger then, elementary through high school. And I was taking a 5-year break from my career in corporate communications to blend my family and to just kind of figure out what was next. And at the end of that 5 years, it was a really cold day. I was living in suburban Indiana. And I saw on the television in my bedroom, which was on in the background while I was folding laundry, that there was an active shooter inside an elementary school in a town called Newtown, Connecticut. And like so many other Americans that day, I just sort of stopped what I was doing and watched the news in tears for the rest of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's still unfathomable that 20 children and 6 educators were slaughtered in the sanctity of an elementary school in America in just minutes. Um, and some point during that night, my devastation, my sadness turned into anger. And so when I woke up the next morning, I just thought, I have to do something. I didn't know anything about organizing. I didn't know anything about really the political process. And I didn't know anything about gun violence, but I knew that when I was a teen growing up in the 80s, Mothers Against Drunk Driving was incredibly influential in changing laws and culture. I can remember sitting at my high school and looking out the window and seeing these very angry mothers with a tow truck pulling a car onto my college camp or my high school campus, and it was like this crumpled car and it still had blood inside it, and their message was don't drink and drive. And I just thought, like, this is a badass group of women who are serious about what they're doing and protecting people. And so that's how Moms Demand Action started. I just sent out a Facebook post, and in 2012 Facebook was still very popular, saying that it was time for women and mothers to stand up to the gun lobby. And that became an offline movement.
You absolutely just unlocked a core memory for me, I think. Like, I remember being in school, I think middle and high school, they brought those cars onto our campus. Like, I distinctly remember that. And, like, it did have a profound impact on me. I've never driven drunk and don't intend to. Like, those things I think really stick with people. So I think it's amazing that you've mobilized the same group of women, moms, to come together against something that is just unconscionable. All of us can remember where we were when we first heard about Sandy Hook. I was in high school. Like, it just completely shifted everything that I understood about living in America. And so I would love to know how your approach to activism has changed since you started that, because that was 2012 and many things in the country have happened since.
Mm. Oh, I mean, it's hard to understand that just 12 years would have such a profound impact
Yeah.
on America and activism. I was a white suburban mom who was afraid her kids weren't safe in their schools. Um, it took that tragedy to get me off the sidelines, even though there was gun violence happening all the time, 30 miles from where I lived.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even know that I would be, I do know, let me say that differently. I do know I wouldn't be the right person to start this organization today in 2000, almost 25. But I was in 2012, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like it took a white woman, I think, to galvanize, in particular, other white women to
Mm-hmm.
say, A, this is a crisis, and B, you can't only be concerned about it when it affects your own family or community.
Right.
We have to be activists to stop gun violence in all communities and of all kinds. And I think that conversation has really snowballed and become incredibly important in the zeitgeist. And look, Moms Demand Action is now the largest volunteer-led grassroots organization in the nation, if not the world. I mean, over 10 million supporters. It's twice as large as the NRA now. And when I step back in at the end of 2023, I handed the baton over to a Black woman who lives in Washington, D.C., a queer woman with 4 kids whose experience with gun violence is much different than mine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think so much has evolved and changed since 2012. It's sort of hard to get our heads around.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, what we have done is to make gun violence one of the top 10 voting issues in this country, and it didn't even break the top 10 before Moms Demand Action. And I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, being a member of a generation where, like, we're experiencing to this day active shooter drills, like, I think about, in the future, I'm not a mom now, I want to be. And, like, what does it look like to know that, like, okay, if I send my kids to school, they're going to deal with this level of trauma for the rest of their lives if this issue is not resolved. And, like, whether it's you're actually experiencing it or just the drills themselves, they're equally traumatic in
Oh,
many ways. And, like,
absolutely.
yeah, and so I think it's just really important that I think our generation, I know that this is one of our top voting issues because we can't fathom. I remember looking at protests from kids my age when we were out marching in the streets about this and seeing, like, why are you guys allowing this to happen? Like we, especially when we weren't of age to vote, like looking and being like, so is anyone going to protect us? And so
Yeah.
I'm grateful to people like you who said, yes, we're going to do our best. But like, it was very like the disillusionment for being an American citizen after that, knowing that like
Yes.
at the end of the day, yeah, you're not as important as the guns. Like your life is just simply not as important. And like that was just beyond sobering, I think.
I think you raised an important point, and a few. First of all, the idea that I had this idea, it was very naive. I thought, oh, everything will change after this horrific shooting tragedy. Laws will get
Yeah.
passed, the attitude toward guns will change. And this idea that the most powerful, wealthy special interest that ever existed would disappear after that tragedy was really naive. Um, the thing about activism is that it takes a long time. The system is not set up for overnight change. I wish it were, because I would have, I would be an expert gardener by now instead of, having been an activist volunteer for 12 years. But it isn't set up for that. And Jessica Valenti, the feminist writer, talks a lot about how white women are really sort of privileged in that they don't like to lose, or they're not used to losing. And that's really the defensive crouch and stance from people who've been doing, mostly Black women, women of color, have been doing this work for decades, right? You lose and you don't give up. And that was part of our organization's ethos as well, which is you always keep going. You lose forward. You're going to lose a lot when you take on such a wealthy special interest, such a powerful special interest,
Right.
but that doesn't mean you get to give up because you lose. One of the biggest losses we had right away was the Manchin Toomey bill failed. It was by a Republican and a Democrat, and it would have closed the background check loophole in this country at a federal level, that in honor of the Sandy Hook school tragedy. And I was sitting in the Senate gallery in 2013 when that failed by a handful of votes. Some of them Democratic senators, right? It's important to remember that in 2012, a quarter of all Democrats in Congress had an A rating from the NRA. A quarter. Not today, none do because of the work we've done.
Yeah.
But it was a complete, all of that change was ultimately incremental. And what we realized in that moment was we were going to have to shift. Congress wouldn't be where this work began, it would be where it ended. And so we started doing this work in city councils and school boards and state houses. And that mostly incremental wins, not all, but many of them incremental, is what leads to revolutions. And I think sometimes that's hard, especially for young people
Yeah.
who want overnight change to wrap their minds around, because it is frustrating and it does feel like the system is set up to tell you not to be an activist. But if you don't give up, you will win.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful message, especially right now, considering what has happened in the last month. Last month really did feel like a year. I was putting together like an Instagram recap, and I was like, it just kept going. The month just didn't end. And so, a little bit of a shift. Speaking of what happened last month, I mean, you and I clearly know that white women are a very important voting bloc. And considering how many white women voted for Donald Trump in this election, still, despite all of our efforts, especially efforts of you and women like Liz Minnella, like we know that white women are voting against their interests. And I know that people can say, like, oh, well, they're leaning towards the Republican Party for X, Y, and Z reasons. But I really would love to know how you unpack white women's orientation for Donald Trump specifically, because I feel like he's a different type of what I really don't even have the words to describe what he represents. But like choosing that over your interests feels like a very different choice than, let's just say, choosing a Republican candidate from 12, 15 years ago.
Right. I mean, at the end of the day, we can't forget that we live in a nation that has systemic white supremacy and patriarchy, and that those things impact us whether we know it or not, right? All of us.
Hmm.
And my friend Brittany Packnett Cunningham, the activist, often says, your whiteness will not protect you from what the patriarchy has in store for you.
Right.
And I really did think that that would shift white women voters this election cycle. I don't know that it didn't. So a lot of what we're talking about right now, just a month after the election, is based on exit polling data.
Right.
Pew data is truly the gold standard, and that won't come out until the spring. There are different analysts who are saying different things. It does look like Kamala Harris outperformed President Biden by 5 points with college educated white women. Those are
Hmm.
probably a lot of the women that showed up for our Zoom,
Yeah.
over 200,000 of them who helped us raise $11 million for Kamala Harris. Like that might have moved that needle, but there aren't enough college educated people to swing an election anymore in this
Right.
country. And I'm really interested in seeing the data on younger white women. We know that they voted in majority for Biden, and it's still unclear what happened this election cycle. I think the real question is, and I hate even putting it in these terms because it does sound so classist, but I don't know that we have other words for it yet. But college educated white women versus non-college educated white women. What I'm really interested in post-election, and I think the lesson from this election is the same from what I learned at Moms Demand Action, which is we just began this work, and white women, you don't get to give up.
Yeah.
You have to keep working to have these conversations because it's going to take several election cycles, if not a generation, to change the trajectory of voting. But I'm really interested in how do we start having these conversations with white women who are not college educated and who either didn't vote or voted for Trump. I think that is the real key to unlocking this going forward.
100%. And I think to your point about us not having the full picture yet, I mean, it was amazing. Like days after the election, everyone has an opinion. We've all figured it out. This is why she lost, all these things. But then, like, by the end of the month, it was like, oh, that landslide actually wasn't a landslide. And like all these, like, I'm like, we have to be patient, guys. Like, there's
Yes.
more to come and more clarity to come. And so I think, especially with Generation Z, like, we're chronically online. Like, like, we are on the internet all day, every day. And so when you're consuming these things and like the defeat felt so magnificent the day after the election when everyone was
Yes.
like, this was the biggest landslide of all landslides. And you're like, is this the country I'm living in? Yes, you might actually be living in that country, but that's besides the point. Like the nuance really is not there yet. And so I
Yes.
really want to echo what you've just said there, that we need to give this some time to really figure out and regroup. And like, I do agree with a lot of people that have been saying like, this really was, to your point, I don't want to be classist, but like this was the election of the uneducated. Like we see
Yes.
now what happens when misinformation and lack of education runs rampant in a country where we're like, I don't even know what number we are now globally in terms of our education, but we're not great. Like, I mean, I
Yes.
live in California. We're not great. Like, there are some
Yes.
issues there. And so, like, part of that mobilization moving forward really does have to come with that education component. I think that that's super important. But you did briefly mention your call. And so I would love for you to walk us through White Women Answer the Call, the initiative and the call, the Zoom call. I was on the call as an ally. I was really excited to be there.
You got to be the ally.
And I was like, this is fun. Because I was also on a woman who we both adore, Joteka Edie. We were on her
Hmm.
call. And so seeing that, I mean, it was that week of Zoom calls was one of the best weeks of my life this year, I think, just in terms of feeling a hope that I have not felt in a very long time, and I'm only 25. Like, and to just know what you were able to accomplish that night. So can you just walk us through from the tweet to the call to the post call, and then I was on one of the Women Wednesdays calls, like just the whole vibe. How did you handle the election?
Well, it's funny because, I thought after I stepped back from Moms Demand Action leadership at the end of 23, I thought, okay, I'm going to just rest and relax and, figure out what's next. And I wrote a book and, it's funny because by the time July rolled around, like I was sort of itching for like, what's next? And
Mhm.
it was, such a shock that in just a weekend, Joe Biden announced he would step back. Kamala Harris became the presumptive nominee. And I was on Instagram and Twitter one night and I saw all of these Black women with these emotional testimonials about how they were on this call and they were in real time saying, now it's 5,000 people, now it's 10,000 people, now it's, and it just kept going up. And they were talking about the money they'd raised. And I had goosebumps just like, wow, look at this amazing outpouring of support for Kamala Harris. And then Black men did something similar, a day or two later. And thanks to menopause, I was wide awake at 3 a.m. in the morning and I decided to tweet, it's when will white women have a similar call to honor and emulate what Black men and women have done? And, it's kind of like Moms Man Action when I posted on Facebook and it like immediately went viral. And all these women were reaching out to me. How do I help you? Let's organize this. Let's do this. And I sat in this chair for about 48 hours. My husband brought me liquid and power bars, and we just organized this call. And um, by the time it rolled around, I mean, it was so immature. We just used my link to raise money for Kamala Harris, which kept breaking. Zoom sent us an email in the middle of the call and said, "Congratulations, you just had the most people attend a Zoom ever in history."
Mm-hmm.
Um, Women are so smart that they figured out they needed to get off the Zoom and watch us on YouTube. So by the time it was over, we had over 200,000 people attend. Uh, Peak Pink was zoomed in live from her private jet after a concert. I mean,
It was
it
epic.
was it crashed and it came back up and it crashed and I was sitting in this chair after it was over thinking, was that horrible or wonderful? I'm not really sure what that was. And then I started again seeing Black women posting and tweeting like, wow, that was cathartic to watch all these white women saying like, this isn't a rally, this is a reckoning. Like we need to talk about how we vote and why we voted this way and how we change it, and that it's not enough to just vote, that we have to do the unglamorous heavy lifting of grassroots activism that Black women have done for so long. And by the time that sad little link that I posted to raise money, by the time that was all counted, 2 days later, we had raised almost $11 million, in just that short Zoom. So, and then, Joe Taka's brilliant idea spawned 1,000 Zooms, right? And
Mhm.
it was just, I thought it was a really fascinating way to show support and raise money that will probably be in the history books. Like this was a new way to
Yeah.
do activism.
No, absolutely. And I spent a lot of time since this was the 40th year since my dad ran for office, like the first time. And I was really just like processing all of the movements and the coalition building and all the things that happened in 84 because I think like my generation, like we're often not looking back at like the 80s specifically to like learn about what
Yeah.
happened in history. Like we're not being taught that in the history books just yet. And so I was really fascinated by the movements that he was, working on then and seeing now what it looks like to activate and to mobilize now. Like maybe we were doing all the door knocking and all the things, but like this Zoom component, this like as awful as the pandemic was, like we have been given such a gift in the ways that we can now connect with people beyond, like we don't all have to fly into California or fly into Alabama to do work. Like we can do it on our computers. So I think that it's really, really amazing and beautiful. And being on that call, I would say for me, one of the things that really stuck out is because a lot of times we're experiencing like performative allyship. And so just this notion of like, yeah, like we got you, but like not really. And like also we're going to take your idea. Like all of the things that like I think Black women came into this room expecting, especially if they weren't familiar with any of you on the call. I mean, I was, but like not everybody was. And like to hear you guys acknowledge Joe Taka, to hear you acknowledge the freedom fighters, the women who had come before, and like to let this be a part of the history, but not be the moment that history is written from this day forth and ignore everything else was just, as a young Black woman, it changed my whole kind of, I don't know, like I feel like it changed my chemistry. Like I was like, oh, we can exist in this world and like I've never had a problem reaching across, racial and gender lines in that way, but to know that like there are a coalition of white women that recognize that there are some issues and want to do better. And like, I don't know, it just completely, I would say my friends and I, we walked out of that call just like, wow. And it was funny how many of us were like all these like Black women in our 20s, like we're getting on white women, answer the call. Like, here we go.
Well, I can't tell you how many people called me and said, "Don't do this. This is cringe."
Oh my
Like,
goodness.
don't do this because you're centering white women. Don't do this because, like, it was a very delicate,
Mm-hmm.
uh, line to follow. It could have gone horribly awry. It really could have. And I only see that in retrospect because it just, 48 hours is not a long time. And I'm really glad that no one called me and said, "I'm trying to talk you out of this," because I possibly could have been. It just ended up being the right mix of people and the
Right.
right conversation.
Absolutely. And so obviously there was the calls, but then there was so much more activating. And like, I know you were a very busy woman. I was exhausted by the end of this campaign season and I wasn't even on the trail nearly as much. And I would just love to know from you, like, what you saw on the ground over the course of the next 100 something days.
Mm. You know, I saw so much energy. I really did think Kamala Harris was going to win
Hmm.
until the last minute. I'm not sure if there were any signs I could have read that would have changed my mind or made me think differently. Um, I just felt like there was so much energy and excitement, and she did feel like the change candidate to me. Um, but, we'll be telling this story for a long time and understanding the data for a long time. 100 days is not maybe long enough to run against someone who has been running for 100 months.
Yeah.
He really has been in the public eye since he came down that damn escalator. So I just think that in a lot of ways, maybe it wasn't winnable from the beginning, and we just had a lot of hope that it would. But I think the election made a difference, and I think it changed our party. I hope for the better. And really, we don't have any other choice but to continue to do this work.
Yeah.
And as exhausting as it may sound, there is a midterm election that we're already gearing up for, that we have to get involved in, that will make a huge difference. And look, I think the conversations happening in the Democratic Party are important, and I do think we have to recalibrate, but I also just want it to be based on accurate data and not anecdote, or someone's political beliefs, right? It really has to be based in what American people want.
Absolutely. And so I think just shifting gears across gender lines, I guess, for a second, like I know that this is very much based on like we don't have all the facts, but like there were a lot of Generation Z men just like even on the internet outside of the polling data who were very, very, very much like we are voting for Trump, no matter if we're men of color, even though a lot of men of color did vote for Vice President Harris. Like I just am trying to think through what it looks like to try to also bring these men along with us, and particularly the young men, because like I mean generationally like we can't we can't go forward if we're so split in this way. And so as much work as you've been doing with women, and I just would love to know overall if you have any thoughts on like what we can be doing, like how can I bring them along to for the party. We all need each other in this for sure.
I agree. And I think we're going to be grappling with that question for a long time. I mean, look, the truth is that Donald Trump is an incredibly talented politician. And
Mm,
that isn't, I don't mean that as a compliment. I mean talented in the worst way possible.
yeah.
And that his team is truly brilliant at inculcating hatred and fomenting fear and obviously stoking sexism, racism, bigotry.
Yeah, all the things.
And we have known because of the generational and gender and demographic shift in this country that's coming, that we are grappling with what does that change mean? And I think in particular white men, as they lose power, frankly, are grappling with what that change means.
Hmm.
And look, this is a once in a generation candidate after a once in a generation pandemic.
Hmm.
And that has reverberations as well that we don't quite understand. I'm the mom of a 24-year-old white man who lives in a pretty red part of California, and all of his friends are conservative. All of them voted for Donald Trump. And I just think there is something to the way the Trump campaign brought young men, young white men in the door, right, through gaming and crypto and
Hmm.
weightlifting, and then they like come in this door through those things that have nothing to do with politics, and they're shot out through a chute where they become MAGA.
Yeah.
And it's almost like guns, right? So gun extremists have brought gun enthusiasts in through this door of gun policy, and they come out a chute on the other end, MAGA. We're seeing that over and over again on the right. And so I just think we have to figure out, is it part media and the way we're communicating, the channels we're using to communicate? Um, is it creating more synergy between young men and women, which we know there's a real divide there?
Hmm.
And is it also looking at the top issues that exit polling is showing were important? The economy, education, housing, all of those things, right? Like, how are we speaking to those issues? So I do think it's going to require a true analysis, but to say that nothing is wrong would be a mistake because clearly, um, even bet like there's this brilliant tactic that the Trump campaign had, which was to get young men to vote to bet on the campaign, and
Hmm.
then because they wanted to win, they voted for Trump because that was their bet.
Right.
It's just, I mean, that is
Feels
maniacal, but also
entirely.
brilliant.
Yeah, I was like, it feels. I was looking at so many things that were happening over the course of their campaign. It was like, is this not criminal? What are
I
we
know.
actually like? It's so beyond. And I think like being 25, I remember the first time that he ran, I could not vote. And it was one of the most devastating elections that I could have experienced, knowing that I felt like I had no power at the time and I could use my voice. But like social media also even wasn't what it is now, crazy
Yep.
enough. Like, and so I have a lot of friends who are activists who are like 17, who were working so hard in this election and couldn't vote. And I mean, I'm looking at like Gen Alpha and just the younger members of Gen Z. And I would just love to know beyond, I think actually more specifically for gun violence prevention efforts, like what can people who don't have the ability at this point in their lives to vote be doing? They want to be engaged, they want to help. Like I think because of the advent of social media, you see a lot of young people who know a lot about what's happening in the world but feel like they have no ability to contribute. So do you have any words of advice or recommendations for them to engage?
Yeah, first of all, I would say don't give up. You probably only remember mostly Donald Trump being president, given your age. And this, I hope it's not the new normal, but it certainly isn't the normal in context of the history of this country. And democracy, I think, is in many ways like a sick child. And maybe this message resonates with a mother, but also with someone who has been a sick kid. And, in the middle of the night, you don't wake up and say to that kid, like, I'm sorry you're still throwing up and you have a fever, but I'm tired and I have to go to bed. You hold that kid's hand through the rest of the night until they get better and you don't leave. And we have this obligation in a democracy to do the same thing. We have to hold our nation's hand until it gets better. And each of us have unique values and abilities and desires that, when combined, show us the right path for what we should do as activists, right? For some people who are introverts who don't want to go out and meet people, maybe they're volunteering to be the data lead for Moms Demand Action because they can sit behind their computer and still make a difference. But maybe if you are someone who's outgoing and enjoys working with people, you're going to create a group in your community that isn't going to show up just every 2 years and knock on someone's door, but you're going to have, what is called relational organizing, where you're having ongoing conversations and people feel involved and they understand that they're part of a community and not just part of an expectation that they'll vote in every election cycle. Maybe, like me, I feel called to continue to have conversations with and bring other white women into the fold because I think, for whatever reason, that is my particular lot in life. But, whatever it is to you that is meaningful, like do that activism. Alice Walker has a quote which is, activism is the rent I pay to live on the planet. Nobody can sit on the sidelines. Nobody can just vote. We all have a role to play in healing democracy, and whatever that is, figure it out and take that work on.
Yeah, that's absolutely so important. And I think like after grieving, and I know that I feel like I'm in a continual like in terms of just grief and like processing, but like I'm also keenly aware that we can't stop now. Like it would
Yep.
be at the detriment of everything that's like and I think because of our generation being chronically online, like it was a lot. Like I actually had to turn off my news subscription for a while because I couldn't keep seeing just the appointments and the things. And like I was still reporting on the news on my podcast, so I had to be engaged. But there was a level of just like dread that I think occurred with our generation, especially because like we're young, frankly. Like we want the world to be just like lollipops and roses and like everything is wonderful. And so like when you attach yourself to a level of hope and it doesn't manifest in the way that you think it will, it can be very hard to figure out how to keep going. And I think that those are very actionable steps. It's just like show up as you can with your skills and your talents and just get in the fight. Because I also think, to your point, we can't keep doing this every like, oh, we're going to engage every 4 years. We're going to engage every 2 years. Like if we don't keep going like every single day until the 2 year mark, every single day until the 4 year mark, then we're setting ourselves up for failure again. Yeah.
Totally agree.
100%. And so I would love to know from you a little bit in terms of your background in corporate communications, like how that's influenced your approach to activism and organizing. Cause I don't know, I feel like particularly with the call, like it was such a hit in ways that like, of course, I don't think anyone could have predicted how much of a hit it would be. But like, I would liken this to like, let's say an Ava DuVernay, who I think is really skilled and has a particular knowledge of marketing, that contributes to her success as a filmmaker. And I feel like your background in communications, I'm assuming, really has contributed to your success as an activist. And so I would just love to know if you have any insights on that.
Activism is storytelling. At the end of the day, it is just telling a story. What is wrong? How can it be fixed? What are the solutions? What could the future look like? Right? That's a story we tell over and over again about anything. Maybe you're trying to get your parents to buy you a car, or maybe you're trying to address climate change. But regardless of what the end goal is, it is all about storytelling. And Malcolm Gladwell talks about anyone who does anything for 10,000 or more hours becomes an expert. And I really cut my teeth out of college in communications, writing speeches, writing press releases. When I worked for General Electric, I was taught how to create a brand. And so I just felt when I started Moms Demand Action, like all the skills that I had culminated over thousands and thousands of hours came together. And the first thing I did was to write a press release and to say I had started this organization. And what that did was all the other women who had the same idea that day decided, oh, this is already in existence, so I'm going to follow her, which, helped make it more
Right.
successful because I also brought new volunteers into the fold. Um, this creating the red t-shirt, we had red before Donald Trump did, which said Moms Demand Action. And women who kind of, are often invisible in society, any woman over the age of 40, right? Wearing that red shirt made them feel invincible, made them feel powerful. They felt like they were total badasses for taking on this gun lobby to protect their families, to protect their communities, to learn. We have done a lot of polling of our volunteers. It's sadly easy to get people to come into the fold after a shooting tragedy. It is
Mm-hmm.
much more difficult to get them to stay, to keep doing
Mm-hmm.
the work of grassroots activism. And so we polled and said, like, we get why you come, but why do you stay? And volunteers told us two things. One is that they felt like we were winning. And that's something that we do as part of the brand. We're constantly saying, like, celebrating wins, and no matter how small, it matters. We talked about losing forward a little bit, like this idea that we'd never give up, that we keep going. And when we lose, we learn enough to win the next time. But the second reason that they say they stay is that they find their people.
Mm.
And there is something about um, feeling obligated not to let other people down and also being excited to find your people. Maybe you live in a red state where you don't think anyone feels the same way you do about gun safety, and suddenly you're working shoulder to shoulder every day to make difference and save lives. Like, that is empowering. And it's just a brand that is, I think, in many ways like lightning in a bottle. And that is an incredibly important part of activism. I teach classes all the time at different universities across the country. And I always say, the most important thing you can do is have your narrative and your mission statement and your messaging, and then create a brand, a look and feel that makes people want to be a part of what you're doing. And, we were able to get donors to take us seriously in those early days because I think we looked much more credible than, frankly, we were. We were just so, just in the first few months, we really didn't have volunteers, but it felt like we were this long-standing organization.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And speaking of finding your people, and I think we've had some people on the podcast. I mean, I think we share guests in that way. Rabbi Sharon Brous was just on recently, and like
I love
I,
her.
I mean, she's just she's everything.
She's amazing.
Yeah, just so freaking cool in all of the ways. And like we're having these discussions about like spirituality, because like when I started this podcast I was like, oh, we're just gonna talk about politics, and then of course like understanding that like politics is infused in every aspect of your life. And like for me, my spirituality is deeply connected to my political activism and my social justice drive. And like if I understand correctly, you are a Buddhist, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
and so I would love to know like how that's influenced your activism and leadership style.
Mhm.
And I'm just super fascinated. I have a friend who I'm really close to, and she converted to Buddhism, and like we're all like navigating our own like religiosity and faith traditions and all these things as we're entering this new phase of our lives where we're like adults, and we kind of feel like adults, but we're also like, okay, are we? So I would just love to know for you like when that journey started and how that's contributed to your work now.
Yeah, I started studying Buddhism in my late 30s. I was raised by a very, very devout Catholic father who actually was in the seminary for about a decade to become a priest and ended up not becoming a priest, but basically is like a civilian priest. Uh, and as you can imagine, he wasn't thrilled about my rejection of the Catholic religion, but it just never felt right to me. And when
Hmm.
I started studying Buddhism, it did. It wasn't like a threat of good and evil. It was more like um, a, a bunch of guidelines for how to live in a way that reduces suffering to yourself and other people. And I
Hmm.
found it really useful, something I could actually practice instead of being sort of afraid of. And so my go-to emotion is anger. It always has been. I'm a very impulsive, easy to anger person. And I think that, the anger can be very harmful if you use it against yourself or other people, but it can be very powerful and impactful if it's righteous anger. And what Buddhism has helped me to do is to focus that anger, or at least to maybe convert it to being more righteous.
Hmm.
And there's always this middle path, and again, I am a highly sensitive, highly reactive person, and so for me to be able to take a beat, calling it the sacred space, for me to be able to find a middle path, which is, nothing is all good or all bad, but most of all to manage my ego, which we all have, and we
Yeah.
all need to, there's a shadow side of everybody's ego, but what I started to feel like when I started Moms Demand Action was that it was almost part of my practice. I never wanted the organization to be about me. When I started early on, a volunteer from Silicon Valley said, "Well, whatever you do, don't get founder syndrome." And I had to Google that. I didn't know what it meant.
Mm.
It's this idea of someone who founds an organization becomes their ego and identity becomes so intertwined with the organization that anything they do, including leaving, disrupts it or dissolves it.
Hmm.
And so I have always practiced not saying I, but to say we. I have always known that my position would be finite, that I would step away one day. Have always tried to look at it through that lens because I knew that it was not just helpful to the organization, but to me too, because when I did leave, it would cause suffering, right? Because
Yeah.
my identity was so wrapped up in it. Um, so I think for me, Buddhism has been an incredibly important guide. I'm so grateful that I found it before I founded Moms Demand Action.
Hmm.
And I think because of that, when I did step back, also there was a whole lot less suffering than there could have been if I wasn't Buddhist.
Yeah, that's really, really powerful. And I think as we're navigating these new waters, that like there are obviously a myriad of faith traditions and practices, and like finding ways to center yourself outside of this work to help contribute to your ability to continue to do the work. Like my faith practice has allowed me to sustain myself over the last month, to know that like I keep going, and that kind of cyclical way of fueling yourself, I think, is so profoundly important. And some people call it a self-care practice, and some people call it a spiritual practice. And like whatever your way is in, like we're dealing with a profound mental health crisis in this country. We're dealing with a generation who is just suffering mentally. And so trying to also put at the forefront of this political work and the work that we want to do together to take care of yourself, I think is really, really profoundly important. And it shows. People know when you're suffering. And in many ways, I mean, we suffer in silence, but also there are ways that it can be very loud when your silence
Yeah.
is booming. And so you don't want that to kind of hinder the work in that way. And so I guess another question I would have is, kind of shifting gears a bit. I know that you're on the board of Emerge America. Is that right?
Yep.
And so I know that that organization is working to get women elected across the country. And so I would just love to know from you, like, what's the work like? How are the vibes? What are we doing? Like, I think this was obviously a really huge, huge election on a presidential level, but also like on a local and state government level. And so I would just love to know from you, like, what has that work been like, and where are we going from here, and how can we all get involved?
Well, now this is where I get up on my soapbox. I really do think there is a moral imperative for women to run for office. Like, it's not a nice to do, it's a must do. And if you are kind and compassionate and concerned, you will make a great elected official. I have spent a lot of time in state houses where 75% of the lawmakers are men and most of them are white men. And I'm sad to say they are not rocket scientists. Uh, you know, if you are a volunteer and an activist, you are more than qualified to be an elected official. And, the saying is, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. And like women are being eaten alive right now, particularly Black women and women of color. So I don't care if it's county coroner or sheriff or city council, school board. You don't have to run for Congress. Figure out where you can serve in your community. Women only hold about 25% of the 500,000 elected positions in this country.
Still?
Still,
That's
25% of the 500,000 elected positions, and the average age to run for office is, it used to be 47. I'm guessing it's younger now, but it's probably still around 40. You don't have to wait until you've had a career or family to run for office. It's something you can do when you are qualified by age to do so, right? You don't even have to go to college. And so I just think it's really important that women are thinking more about that as a moral imperative in their lives. And I'm really heartened by all the women that we have trained. Emerge America only trains progressive women to run for office. Um, Moms Demand Action volunteers routinely realize that they don't want to just shape policy, they want to make it after they've been activists for a while. So many volunteers have run for office and won, including 3 members of Congress. So I'm excited, but I also think it's easy to look at politics right now and to not want to be involved in it. And I feel like it's part of my role to encourage and to cheerlead and to hold other women's hands as they just make that decision and make that journey because we do need more women in office.
absolutely, especially when women's rights are, I mean, they've always been on the chopping block in some capacity, but like right now we're seeing a war against women, it feels like.
Yep.
So like to have your voices be heard in that capacity is so important. And like I think about, I mean, for myself, like I was feeling a lot of like just fear, I think, after the election. And like, I don't think that fear is necessarily going to go away, but for a minute, I mean, and I say a minute, it was only a month, but like, I really was like processing, well, like, how public do I need to continue to be? Are people going to start coming for me, doxing, like all these things? And like, I know that a lot of content creators and public facing people were thinking through those concerns, but also, if all of us decide that we're too scared to fight and we all retreat, then who is going to be our voice against the
Yep.
opposition? And so, like, you take your minute, take your second to freak out, and then we go, okay, we can't all leave. We can
Yep.
all we can all hold space for each other. There can be times when some people retreat and other people are more forward facing, but I think it's so important that we take this call. I know that there's people who are trying to make sure that we mobilize, like David Hogg, making sure that we mobilize young people to run for office. And I think to your point about women and the different qualifiers that we think, I think we, first of all, we assume that we need to be overqualified in spaces that white men specifically have shown over time are not overqualified and they still show up for jobs. But like even young women, I think like we are often trained under this myth that like, hey, you need to have a husband, you need to have kids. Like if not, you're not a candidate that anybody would vote for. Like people come in with these assumptions about where they need to be in their lives. And so I think it's so powerful to hear from you that like just show up. If you're
Just
of
show
age
up.
and you care, just show up.
Yep. If I had waited until there was everything I needed to know about Moms Demand Action, including gun violence, organizing, the legislative system, I still wouldn't have started it. You have to build the plane as you fly it sometimes.
Yeah, that is so powerful. And a few more questions before we lead over to our Gen Z guest to ask a question. I guess like I'm thinking through because I think particularly in a forward facing capacity, the coalition building that you have done and others have done in this space, and particularly the connection between what we're seeing now, where white women and women of color are showing up in these ways together, which I think is so powerful and should not be understated. What does it look like for you moving forward with this like army of women who are like, yeah, no, we're in this together in ways that like I can't say that we were like that in 2020 or 2016. Like there's a different vibe now, and it's a vibe that I don't want us to lose. And so like, do you have any thoughts moving forward on how we can continue to galvanize this group of women?
I think we talked about a sacred space earlier, like in between stimulus and response, in between the election and what's next. I feel like I'm sitting in that right now.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes if you act too quickly, it can cause harm or it can be unhelpful. So I am really trying to figure out what is the best way forward for me. How can I be of most service using my values, my skills, what I desire to do? Um, I think for me that might have something to do with building more community, kind of like Moms Demand Action, but
Mm-hmm.
but for women to have conversations and to feel fulfilled and to feel empowered. And yes, that includes conversations about politics, but maybe that is how we combine, the groups we talked about before within the white women's space. And so I'm having a lot of conversations about that. I'm going to New York next week to meet with some amazing activists and organizers to talk about what's next. I'm giving myself until the new year to figure that out. And I know a lot of people have a lot of different ideas, and it's, I think, really exciting. But I I think it's going to take all of us doing different things, right? I wish I could just say, hey, all we have to do is create this podcaster like Joe Rogan for the left, and then we're done. It isn't that simple. There are a
Right.
lot of different things that will need to be done. And so each of us has to figure out what that is.
That is really, I'm just honestly, I think I'm kind of glad you had that answer because I think a lot of people are very quick to be like, we do these three things, mix it in a bowl, and now we have like democracy. And it's like, that may not be our path forward. And like, I think and I know a lot of other content creators and activists in this space have felt an immense amount of pressure to have answers for everything right now. And like, we accomplished a historic feat that I think will continue to unfold in decades to come as to how historic it actually was and like what this moment meant in the history books for all of us. But I think it's so healthy for us to be like, okay, we all have our ideas. We're going to start strategizing, but like, we don't have to have an answer tomorrow. Because
Yep.
also, again, as you've said in the beginning of this interview, we don't have all of the facts yet. So
Yep.
showing up and being like, these are our answers without that feels a little quick. And so I think it's really just a healthy practice for Gen Z. And I think a lot of us are just in a space now where like for so many people in this generation, this was their first time ever being engaged in the political process in life, even
Yep.
understanding like what branches of government really do, because frankly in some schools that is not really clear. Civic
Yep.
education in this country is a whole situation, but like I just want us to make sure that we're continuing to find ways to hold on to the hope that we had. Because I think in this time where we do need to take a step back, there is a sense of like existential dread as we see the news reports and like you hear Trump's name like 15 times a day in ways that like it's a little I think I have a little PTSD from his last campaign and candidacy and like what that looks like for all of us. So I just think it's really important for us to kind of take a beat, as you said, and like really assess like, yes, there will be more to come. And I think the new year is a great time for us to like regroup, but we can take this time. It's also the holiday season. We're gonna hopefully be with our loved ones and just take a minute. So I think that that's really powerful. And I think I have one more question for you before we bring in Brian. I hope it's not like a crazy question. So there's obviously lots of conversation right now about like intersectional feminism and like when we look at there's so many different types of feminisms and then there's womanism and like there's all these different ways and ideologies to exist in this world as a woman who is not into the patriarchy and into sexism. Do you prescribe to a particular lens or do you use a certain title or are you just existing as Shannon?
I think I am just existing as Shannon.
That is so fair. I think honestly, it's like it's important because I think some people will then like hear this interview and then go like, oh well, she's this, oh she's that. But like it's okay for like someone to also say like this is who I am. And so I think let's have Brian bring in our guest speaker. I just like want to make sure that we have different Gen
Sure.
Z voices because I don't want to be like the prescribed Gen Z voice discussing politics every day. It doesn't feel like we are not a monolith. Everyone has opinions.
Hello, my name is Nina and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. My question is after the 2024 election, a lot of youth activists expressed disappointment and lack of motivation for their causes. So, Shannon, what are your words of encouragement for those young activists?
I got this question so many times from the students I teach at universities, when I talk about activism, and I I get it, right? I mean, if you have been only seeing this Trump chaos for most of your voting life or even beyond, it probably just seems like it's easier to check out and that you can't make a difference. I am someone who started Moms Demand Action with a Facebook post and helped change laws and save lives. Like I know firsthand that every single person I'm not a unicorn. I am not a brilliant activist. I'm just not. I'm just like an average person who got really mad and wouldn't give up. we can all be that. Every single person is a leader. And we cannot afford to sit on the sidelines. Even there is no perfect candidate. There is no perfect policy. The point of democracy is to vote in the best person or the best policy and then continue to make change, to continue to evolve it. And during the conflict in the Middle East, there were so many students who felt like the administration, they were telling me, wasn't doing enough to protect Palestinians. And my answer wasn't, well, then give up. My answer was elect the very best candidate and then go lay outside their office for the next 5 months. Like, this is a sport you have to participate in, right? Like, you have to show up in a democracy, and not just online, like in real life. And that is, again, as Alice Walker says, the rent you pay to live on the planet. You find the best candidate and the best policy, and then you make it better. And that will be hard work, and you will lose a lot, but eventually you will win. And incrementalism leads to revolutions. Incrementalism is not a dirty word. It is how change is made in this system. If you don't like the system, then fight to overhaul the system. Maybe that's what you're going to focus on. But you can't give up and check out, because when you do, the bad guys win. And it's really sort of the height of privilege to say, I don't want to participate, because so many people don't have that privilege. And they're the ones that will be hurt by people who want to exploit and pervert democracy.
Oh, that is just so powerful. You touched on all the things. I think incrementalism is like, it's so important to acknowledge that this is not a race that's going to be won overnight. Even if Vice President Harris had been elected, it would have not been over that day. And so I think it's just profoundly important. And I thank you for your wisdom. And like, I think honestly, for some people who are just overwhelmed, this is a great episode to listen to just be like, it's okay. Shannon Watts is telling you it's okay. We keep working. We also take some breaks. Like all the things can exist. And can coexist for all of us. So I thank you so much for your time and for coming on Push the Next Generation. Goated. If you want to submit a question to our guest, DM at Push the Next Generation Pod for a chance to make it onto future episodes. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Push the Next Generation, recommend it to a friend, follow on socials at Push the Next Generation Pod, and please give us lots of reviews and comments. We love to see them. Thank you so much for watching and listening. See you next week on Push the Next Generation. And in the meantime, find your safe space this season. We all need it. This is Ashley Jackson signing off.